Before I begin this video, I want you to heed a warning. This video will be covering the prospect of death and mortality, as well as hypothesizing the inevitable demise of some lives in Genshin. I know that some people view these characters for comfort, and therefore see themselves in them for safety, so please do not watch this video if you are sensitive to those discussions. Also, please do not think this video is in any way hateful towards any of these characters, because my own emotions and preferences will not be put into play when making this analysis. All the information for this video is analysis based on existing and hypothesized narrative outcomes that both already and could exist in the story. Please watch at your own discretion. Human life is fleeting. Genshin Impact's themes on mortality, reincarnation, and death revolve around that unyielding reality. All things must come to an end eventually. This includes the tales of the very people we meet in our journey. To say that any of these characters are above that reality is just naive. And we know that MiHoYo themselves have quite a track record of ending a character's narrative, playable or otherwise. But why? Why would you ever want to speculate on a character's death? Well, character death is one of the most important literary techniques used by authors to invoke emotion and urgency in a tale. As much as it is a heavy topic, recognizing a character's mortality is important in cultivating a well-rounded story. To dismiss it entirely means that you're removing the aspect of a character that makes their writing exceptional. After all, it's why we regard our lives to be so fruitful. We know our time is limited, and therefore every aspect of what we do becomes important. Exploring possibilities, no matter how distasteful they may be, is imperative in studying this topic. No character in this story has complete immunity to character death. The percentage is low but not absolutely zero in the grand scheme of things, especially not in the hands of a story such as Genshin Impact. Each character has a certain percentage of how likely their death will be used to either raise the stakes of the story or invoke strong emotional character growth from others. There are two reasons why we can't completely cross off anyone's character deaths, regardless if they're side characters or otherwise. First and foremost, the overarching narrative of Genshin will eventually be war between several sides: the Abyss, the Fatui, Celestia, and Teyvat. Therefore, it is almost impossible not to have casualties. Secondly, the story itself has proven to be capable of taking nosedives into unexpected territories, especially if the characters are key players. The more involved the character is in the story, the more they put themselves as emotional investments. So let's begin. Whose demise may come in Genshin Impact's future? Random character deaths are not what we're going for. The criteria for these deaths are as follows. Is death symbolic enough for the character's story? Would their death have a place in the plot? Would there be narrative consequences should they die? And will this have massive impacts on other characters' existing plot threads? This video, again, is simply a literary analysis on characters in Genshin Impact, and not indicative of any final product or any concrete story evidence. So strap in, because this is going to be a long one. Albedo's tale is one whose end is already foretold to us by himself. From the very beginning, his narrative consisted of finding perfection by following a dead art known for its volatility and danger. Out of all the characters in Genshin, it is the chief alchemist of the Knights of Avonius who knows his death more than anyone else's. One day, there will come a time where his own search for the truth of the world will destroy him. And perhaps maybe the sins of his birth will come back to haunt him in the form of abyssal corruption. We know that Rosaria is wary of him, and we know that he is hoping we would be the one to end him, should the time come he breaks. Therefore, it isn't impossible that the reality is we will kill him with our own hands. But perhaps his death would not be a bloodbath, but rather a somber occurrence. the last lesson he has in his time alive. He is not human, or rather, Albedo is a homunculus. Therefore, in his whole life, he had been taught how to give life to the inorganic. Perhaps his final lesson would be about giving death. His death would be one of the most devastating should it come the way he expects it to come. His death would come in the blaze of glory, where Mondstadt is defending its people from him. He would tear down friends and foes alike, and those that once respected and befriended the lonely alchemist would be faced with the abomination of Chemia. The emotional consequence this would bear on Jean, Lisa, Kaya, and especially Klee would be heartbreaking. And perhaps this would be one of the turning points in the story where the knights are actively helping Aether fight against the abyss and the corruption that befell Conria. The tale of Diluc Rangnivinder and Kaya Alberic is littered with the prospect of vengeance and death. With the rising threat of the abyss and the Fatui, it isn't wrong to say that both brothers will eventually be in the spotlight should the time come that they will have to fight for themselves. Both the brothers are experienced with dealing with death. Their father was slain in cold blood in front of Diluc, and Kaya was tasked with being the future for a dead civilization, two separate paths intertwining with the eventual coming of a war. The two brothers whose fate is to stop a being much greater than themselves. Diluc, the Fatui, and Kaya, the cause of Conria's fall. But their death would not be together. Fate is not that kind. A testimony of loss and secrecy that the two brothers bear the motif of. The loss that had carried them through their adulthood would only be cemented by only one half's death. The regret that they had spent so much of their life apart that when the moment they are together, it is already too late. Narratively, this would spike ambition in whichever brother was left. Whether Diluc dies by the hands of the Fatui, or Kaya dies to the abyss, or it is the other way around, it doesn't matter. This would be a very cutting death, because these two characters are close allies of the Traveler far more than any other. These two were the ones that helped him against Storm Terror and welcomed him into Mondstadt when he was still adjusting to Tevat. Diluc and Kaya are the Traveler's older brother figures, reliable figureheads in Mondstadt, and good friends to the other knights despite unsettling history. For them to die would just be unfortunate. Lisa Minchie's tale is one of uncertainty, and if a person were to wonder why such a humble librarian of the Knights of Avonius would be considered an important character death in the grand scheme of the story, we have to understand that Lisa has been a close and reliable friend to the Traveler from the very beginning. She had been quite the source of information for him in his travels, and have provided him several books when he was still new to the world. To say that she is a side character is not unfounded, of course, but she still holds sentimental value that could not be replicated. But Lisa's tale is still the most bizarre out of all, because her demise is not shown to the world as outrageously as the rest of the other characters on this list. Tempus Fugit is the name of her constellation, meaning time flies. Her name card states the following: an hourglass marks the end of the workday for Lisa. Its sand moves fast. It is also possible that her own search for the secrets of the unknown have shortened her lifespan. In her voice lines, it's hinted she is saving her energy when she needs it the most. It is considered that her time in Sumeru has affected her health negatively, and that should a person demand too many miracles from the gods, first should consider if you are willing to pay the price they ask. When she received her vision, she always wondered if the gods had demanded a price for the gifts they gave, and with that, she grew fearful of the truth. In Mona's voice line, the Tempus Fugit also state that there is a trade-off between knowledge and time, and as the sands fall, so does a moment of time, or life, dies for good. It should also be added that in an interview in March 2020, Lisa was also mentioned in one of the questions. It stated that she once touched a magic book when she was young, which gave her most of her powers, but it cut her life by half, so she only has a few years left to live. The consistency of the quote has yet to be tested, especially since this was probably done before the release of the actual game. But regardless, Lisa's death would come as a forewarning, especially to the traveler who is a glutton for knowledge. I believe her demise would come in the chapters of Sumeru, where she would be most prominent as an active scholar helping the traveler. Or perhaps she would even intervene and warn the traveler of the kind of dangers in Sumeru. Lisa was always the motherly figure who would warn others. Therefore, it isn't impossible to deduce maybe she'd tell the traveler of her fate should the time call for it. Let's move on to the other characters that have a more upfront way of confronting their potential demise. Tartaglia is an agent of destruction and chaos. The 11th of the Fatui Harbingers is no stranger to jumping headfirst into danger for the sake of power. But, even as a fighter first and foremost, Tartaglia is not blind to the injustices and deceit that come from his colleagues in the Fatui. His loyalty to the Tsaritsa is unquestioned, of course. But what about the Harbingers? He even said something as treacherous in the past as defeating the other 11, which should be grounds for execution. However, despite his insatiable lust for fights, his sense of conquer is unwavering, as well as his prospect of family. Should his death come, it would be by the hands of the Fatui Harbingers themselves. Firstly, his ability to use his foul legacy transformation already eats away at his body, and since the intricacies of delusions are not yet known to most, we know that prolonged usage of abyssal magic can shorten a person's lifespan. We also know that he is very much human, and that the power of delusions and abyssal magic could have more severe effects on him than we realize as an audience. Secondly, what would the implication of Tartaglia and the Traveler's friendship be? We know that the Fatui are no strangers to using underhanded tactics to get what they want, but they won't engage in direct combat if it isn't what they were supposed to do. So who is to say that Tartaglia's excursions with the Traveler and the constant mannerisms he displays against the other Harbingers wouldn't have repercussions? In the near future, should the Harbingers find him too volatile to be kept alive, would they not use the same underhanded tactics to permanently silence him? For example, harming his family. His death would be the ultimate tale of a reformed villain. In the beginning of Liyue's story quest, he was just a one-dimensional villain who used conniving words to find information in people that he needed. But when his story quest dropped, we saw a much deeper side to Ajax. His death would be the foul legacy of a young man who was offered power and corrupted by it, only to redeem himself by protecting those he loves and cares for. Zhao's story is plagued by the motif of slow ruination of one's body and soul, despite years of benevolent deeds. His story is quite unfortunate, as though he lives day and night in the shadows protecting the mortals of Liyue from demons, he cannot live in peace. The corruption of the Vigilant Yaksha is a topic that I have already covered in another video. Should Zhao's death come, it would inevitably come from either abyssal corruption or his own karmic debt. Whoever he used to be will be lost to darkness in the last moments of his life. And whether, just like Albedo, we will be the ones to silence him, or he silences himself as the last moment of his own sacrifice, will be up for fate to decide. However, his death is much more different than the others from this list. While the others will face a demise unwarranted, Zhao would finally get the dreamless sleep he deserves. Zhao's demise is hinted multiple times in the story of Genshin, and perhaps should he die, the Vigilant Yaksha will finally achieve the peace he has fought for. The residents of Inazuma are on the brink of war. The threads of their fragile peace are breaking, and it is inevitable that casualties are on their way. All the playable characters of Inazuma immediately have a higher percentage of demise due to the environment they are in. However, while it should be said that not all chances of their demise are equal, it should be noted that Kazuha is an interesting character to consider. At first, I will admit, he was never on this list. I did not think him too significant to even return to the plot, and thought he would be written out as necessary. But then, when considering who he is and what he stood for, there are several potential death flags that show for the Ronin. I will not be focusing on how he will die, and frankly, I genuinely do wish that I will be incorrect and that he will be fine in 2.1, but regardless of emotion, I will focus on the symbolism of his potential death. Firstly, his whole character story, much like Diluc and Kaya, is motivated by vengeance. While it is in a much smaller regard, and Kazuha himself is a pliant character, the reason why he returns to Inazuma is to fight for the people who have been wrongfully judged and condemned by the Raiden Shogun, his good friend included. When considering this, that means that death was always a big factor of his character's story. Secondly is one of the criteria for a considerable death: impact. Kazuha is the first Inazuman character we have ever met as a playable. Therefore, he holds a lot of part in the community's heart as a fan favorite. He is in the perfect position to elicit strong emotion within the audience, who was already invested in his story. However, in the grand scheme of the plot, he is insignificant. When considered against the warring commissions, the Fatui harbingers being involved to pull the strings, and the divine rule of the Archon's ideals, Kazuha's death would unfortunately not have that big of a plot impact. Should MiHoYo need a character to raise the stakes and urgency of Inazuma's war, he is in the perfect balance of being important enough for the community to acknowledge the weight of what they're fighting for, but narratively insignificant enough that his death would not have too massive narrative changes required. Thirdly, the third symbolism is the most important, however. What would happen to the characters left behind? Should he die, the traveler would have more motivation to stop whatever war was happening in Inazuma, because rather than a nameless soldier being killed in front of him, it is a living and breathing companion of his that was mercilessly slaughtered. This would set the reality for what tales to come. The resistance, especially Goro and Kokomi, would have more of a reason to involve themselves into the fight, and be motivated to work even harder against Baal and the Fatui. Beidou would be motivated to work with the resistance, and perhaps provide mercenaries through the Crux fleet. And lastly, Kazuha. His death would mark the end of his journey, just as how he started. But will he die with a scorn on his face as the thunder strikes? Or would he die with pride, knowing that he followed the footsteps of his old friend? The death of a god has repercussions to the world around him. A god's vessel is far too powerful that when one's death comes, it could have catastrophic effects to the world. So, what happens when a god as strong as Barbados is silenced permanently? From the very beginning and up to this day, Venti is a valued friend of the traveler. However, even he is not impartial to secrets. In his bright and cheery nature hides a god that knows the secrets of centuries, and especially the demise of the godless civilization. When observing Venti's disposition in the story, he tends to take a much more ignorant approach in dealing with future problems. But he isn't one to abandon the people of Mondstadt should they call for him. Venti by no means is a passive individual. Though he advocates for rest and relaxation most of the time, he was present for most of the first story quest and had not even let up against Senora despite being injured heavily. He is a fighter before he is a lover, a god born from battle, not ballads. I feel as though his death would come when Celestia finally descends from the heavens one last time to silence the Tsaritsa and the Abyss. His death would be the perfect circle for how he even came to power, fighting to protect Mondstadt and those he cares for. By the side of the traveler, the god of winds would stand, much like how the Wisp and the nameless bard stood side by side when fighting the Caribbean. Except this time, it is he that falls in battle. His death would be the true realization of the traveler that the reality of Celestia and Teyvat is cruel, and Venti would die along with the traveler's happy memories of Mondstadt, opening their eyes to the truth of Teyvat's harsh world. And that leaves me with the last character death that would bear the most symbolism: Aether and Lumine. Their fates when coming to the world of Teyvat had always been ruination, and while both are under the guise of main protagonist and antagonist, even that could not protect them when they eventually cross swords. Their battle will be the final clash between a being who loved Teyvat dearly, who has seen through the evils and goods of the earth but still decided to protect those they care for despite understanding that the truth of Teyvat's world is anguish and misery, versus a being with immeasurable power and rule over the darkness, who is convinced that their fate with destiny deems the end of the very land they once came to know as home. Much like their homeworld, both the twins are fated for a destiny of ruination. However, like Diluc and Kaya, only one can perish. One must survive and live in the stead of the other, and whether it is the traveler or the abyss sibling that survives, it doesn't matter. They must either succumb to the fate laid out by the gods, or wage war for the sake of salvation. In the story of Genshin that is filled with divine motifs, religion, and reincarnation, mortality seeps into the plot so easily. I believe that death in Genshin is almost necessary if they want to deliver a memorable plot. Because while I do love these characters to the bone, I do believe that having properly executed and symbolic deaths is important to flourishing the story. I really wish, however, that I am completely wrong. This is one of those topics that I looked at objectively as a writer, but wish I'm completely wrong as a player just because I love them. But if Genshin Impact can make the players care so much for these characters that talking about their death is almost blasphemous in the community, then I'm glad that is the case. It just means that they have made great characters. Regardless, I simply love thinking of the hypotheticals, wrong or otherwise.